Welcome to Judaism Demystified, a podcast for the perplexed. Join us as we explore some of the most fascinating Jewish and Torah-related topics with our esteemed guests. By tackling some of the biggest questions you likely won't find addressed elsewhere, we aim to shed light on important issues and inspire a return to the fundamentals. Enjoy the show. Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. Dr. Copan, although you are Christian and we are Jewish, we deeply value the importance of emphasizing what unites us. Too often, interfaith dialogue becomes centered around debates, but our focus today is on finding common ground. We don't have to agree on everything. In fact, especially during a time when anti-Semitism is so horrifyingly widespread, we truly appreciate the love and support many Christians offer to our people, a virtue you exemplify. With that said, our audience consists mostly of Orthodox Jews who may not be familiar with you or your work. Can you briefly introduce yourself and share your expertise?
Sure. I have just want to say thank you, first of all, for inviting me to be part of this program. I'm grateful for another audience than what I typically speak to, and I'm grateful for the Jewish community that you represent, and again, stand with you all during this time of anti-Semitism on the rise, and am again grateful to show solidarity with you and your Jewish community. So God bless you all.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that.
In terms of my background, I have an undergraduate degree in biblical studies. I also went on to do further study in the biblical languages, Old and New Testaments, at a graduate level, and also added to that degree, the Master of Divinity degree, Master of Arts in Philosophy of Religion. Actually, William Lane Craig was a professor of mine during those days. And then I went on eventually to get my PhD in philosophy. So I have basically this kind of integrated background in biblical studies, theology, and philosophy. And those things have stood me in good stead. And so I've worked on various books in all of those areas. And I my first book on is God a Moral Monster came out, defending the God of the Hebrew Bible against some of the critics from the New Atheist movement, I basically wrote an article and then would eventually write that book, Is God a Moral Monster? And it received a very good response. The book continues to do well. And I added to that collection with another scholar, Matt Flanagan. We co-authored a book called Did God Really Command Genocide in 2014. So the Moral Monster book in 2011, the Did God Really Command Genocide in 2014. And then in 2022, I came out with another book, the trilogy, third of the trilogy, to write a book, Is God a Vindictive Bully, in which I cover even more questions from the Hebrew Bible, the imprecatory Psalms, the flood of Noah, the firstborn of Egypt, and so forth, trying to add a lot more material to what I covered in the previous books. And so I hope this will serve as a helpful complementary guide to readers who want to have a breadth of understanding of some of these difficult passages and so often misunderstood passages from the Hebrew Bible.
Well, we really appreciate that, and we actually are so thrilled. Hopefully we can cover some of those topics. I'm sure it's going to be difficult, but here goes with the first question, which is, modern readers often fall into the trap of recency bias, approaching the Bible through a 21st century lens. This can cause them to miss how revolutionary the Bible truly was for its time. What are some key examples that would help a skeptic appreciate the Torah's positive impact on humanity? Could you also compare these examples to the more primitive laws of the ancient Near East, like the Code of Hammurabi, to highlight the radical and groundbreaking nature of the Mosaic laws?
Sure. Yeah, happy to cover those. And it's a a very dense and robust set of questions that we can try to unpack. First of all, in the question, I wanted to just address the matter of the golden rule, as it were, of interpretation. That when you're writing, you would want someone else to treat your texts fairly, and so when you're reading someone else's text, you do that as well. And unfortunately, a lot of people who are critical of the Old Testament are very dismissive. They haven't looked at context. They haven't looked at the ancient Near Eastern background. They have done often very little homework. And here, sometimes it can be very frustrating to kind of build a case carefully, looking at words and comparing context and so forth, only to be dismissed by the wave of a hand and showing little regard for the patience that it requires to unpack these things. And so when we're talking about an ancient Near Eastern setting that is far different from our own, it's far removed from our own modern situation in both language, culture. It is a world away, a couple of worlds away from us, as it were. And so there are some things about the ancient Near Eastern setting that relate to, say, blood and semen, certain taboos related to impurity or uncleanness, and we don't have a context for that. And so showing patience and saying, well, what do these taboos mean in an ancient Near Eastern setting, rather than saying, oh, that's primitive, that's crazy, which is often the response that one gets from kind of the casual, less than serious-minded critic. So basically, we want to ask, well, what if we approached the the Hebrew Bible? I say Old Testament, but Hebrew Bible, in a way that is basically taking into account the history, the context. What if we treated it with charitability rather than suspicion? How would we go about doing that? And so one of the ways in which we would approach this would be to simply look at how certain practices were understood. When we look at, say, sacrifices, how were sacrifices understood in the ancient Near East? What is their significance? Is there some kind of a carryover for us even today as we look at the nature of sacrifices? And you can see something that is much more, I think, tangible in terms of, say, our basic religious impulse that we all have, being made in the image of God, that we are made for something transcendent. We are made for something deeper. And so we deal with issues such as guilt and shame and feeling impure, and that's why so many different religions in the world, and even we have our own psychotherapeutic ways of doing this, of kind of finding cleansing for ourselves, of purifying ourselves, of ridding ourselves of filth, of impurity, of kind of a feeling of dirtiness. So we do those sorts of things, and when we make those sorts of connections with how we understand something that could be similar in our day, we say, oh, there's a point of comparison here that we could undertake. So those are just a few examples, and what I try to do in addressing the new atheists like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and others who are kind of mocking a lot of these sorts of practices, to say, hold on a minute, let's pull back and see the very rich significance, that you may be surprised by the sorts of things that you see that actually are rich and deep and very relevant to our lives. So another way of looking at this too is when we use certain words, like in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the translation slave or slavery has very loaded emotive connotations that connect to the antebellum South, and I know we'll get to that later on. But what is often transferred is a modern understanding of, quote, slavery, and it is basically thrust upon the biblical text and there is no nuance, there is no shading. It's assumed that it's one and the same. And what I'm trying to do is say we need to pull back from this and say that there is first a better way of rendering these texts, like a word like eved, servant, and also looking at what was actually practiced in ancient Israel. Does this look like the antebellum South, or is this something quite different? And as I try to point out, this is indeed quite different. And there is a portion in my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully, where I try to draw these various comparisons between the Torah and the other ancient Near Eastern law collections to show how remarkably different they are in their heartbeat, in their tenor and how they view persons and so forth. So, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 4. There is this impulse for the Israelites to show their own distinctiveness so that the nations around them will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. This is what the Lord wants the outside observers to see about Israel. And so you see that as you explore more deeply, you see that behind that exhortation is actually a worldview of difference between what we see in the Mosaic law and these other ancient Near Eastern collections. So, for example, we could talk about how the dignity of persons is so strongly highlighted in the Mosaic law. Whereas in other ancient Near Eastern law collections, instead of having this fundamental equality, all human beings made in the image of God, you have these hierarchies that are created. You have a hierarchical structure, and you also have punishments that correspond to that hierarchy, such that those people who are at the top of the hierarchy have a more diminished punishment, and those at the bottom have more severe punishments. So there is a kind of selectivity going on in terms of how you view human dignity, and also how you view these corresponding punishments that go along with it. So there's an intrinsic dignity in the Mosaic law, but there's a selective dignity in the other nations' law codes. We also have certain how do you treat foreigners, for example, those who are treated as those who are outsiders in Israel. For example, a runaway slave who comes from another nation is allowed to settle in any of Israel's cities, but you don't have that same sort of regard for the foreigner in other nations. You have a very strong emphasis, for example, on personhood in the law code of Moses, but there's a greater emphasis on things, property, in other ancient Near Eastern law collections. You also have, for example, what's unique in the ancient Near East is the Sabbath law for the people of Israel, and there is no parallel, no comparable law that gives people rest, both the native as well as the foreigner in Israel. So there is a great understanding of the need for those rhythms, for giving rest and refreshment to the people and even to animals. There is a much stronger emphasis in the ancient Near East on the surrounding laws, on the kind of the rights of kings, and a diminished sense of rightness or rights for the average citizen. We can talk about concern for the poor, how there are provisions for the poor in Israel, gleaning laws that you're not to charge interest. But again, in the nations surrounding Israel, you don't have those provisions like gleaning laws. You don't have term limits of 6 years, and then the 7th year the contract is over, and then the person who's been in servitude is free from debt and free to move about as before the indenture. You have all manner of concerns for the poor in Israel, but those things cannot be said for the surrounding nations. I keep going, but hopefully that gives an idea of the greater humanity that is shown in the Mosaic law, and how Israel is to be informed by this very significant event, the Exodus, and how because the Israelites were in bondage as aliens in the land of Egypt, the Lord is reminding them to look out for the orphan, the widow, the alien, because you too were once aliens in the land of Egypt. So that's 36 times that exhortation is given to the people of Israel in the Mosaic Law.
So there are those are obvious ones where you see like, wow, there's care for the orphan and the widow and the stranger. But like even to put into context something like the Sotah laws, right? The woman who's accused of having an affair, it when compared to like the trial by ordeal of like the Hammurabi's law, where women are just thrown into a river to die, and then say, oh, if they survived by miracle, then she was innocent, which of course would never happen. Where this is a way of protecting a woman who's being accused, who this is a way for her to like just go home with your husband. Everything's you drink this potion, and then like nothing happens. You go home. So I think like there's little things like that I think a lot of people don't appreciate.
There is the embarrassment part, though. That's not trivial.
Of
Meaning
course not.
The whole
But
ordeal
her head is
traumatic to a
covered.
certain extent. I wouldn't go as like, I wouldn't say it like, oh, she just did it and went home. Like it's there's an ordeal there, but yeah.
I mean, her head is covered, so there's some level of protecting her identity also. They uncover her head when she comes into the ceremony. But anyway,
but I would say this too, that there is kind of the reverse in, for example, Deuteronomy 25, where there is the levirate law, where if an older brother dies, then the younger brother is to marry the widow in order to so that the name may not die out in Israel. But if a younger brother refuses to do so, then the woman, the brother's wife, it says, in Deuteronomy 25, shall come to him in the sight of the elders, pull his sandal off his foot, and spit in his face, and shall declare, thus it is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. So you do see the woman on the other side of that there is an empowerment for her as well. And again, there is a kind of empowerment for the woman too, in that in Numbers 5, where there is the trial that she goes through. But again, as was mentioned, if she is innocent of any adultery, then there is no consequence to her. She doesn't have to fear it. There may be a being put on the spot, but it becomes clear that the husband's accusations were false, and she is vindicated and can hold her head high.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the greater point that you're making is, and we'll get into specifics, difficult passages and difficult areas in the Bible. But I think what you're trying to say is that when you look at the Torah as a whole, right, there is a lot of room to say that the Torah should be given a charitable approach, because the track record of almost the entire book is trying to build a moral society, and it is starkly different from all other books that were in existence, and we should take that into consideration instead of just projecting today's modern values and assuming it onto the Bible without critical thinking, especially when you see on the larger whole that the Torah it takes morality very seriously.
Yes, and one of the things that you see repeatedly in the Torah is the great concern for those who can easily be taken advantage of, those who can easily be marginalized, the vulnerable. And again, that triad of the orphan, the widow, the alien, the ones who can most easily be taken advantage of in society, those are the ones you're to look out for the most. So it's not as though there's some sort of a justification for oppression. Oh, this person's a foreigner. We can do what we want. We can be severe with that person. No, there is this, you remember your origins. You remember that you were once oppressed in the land of Egypt.
Right. And we also, don't even pay attention to this, but honoring parents in the ancient world, especially the way we understand the honoring of father and mother, is also responsible for them as they get old. and taking care of them, that is something that was unnatural to the ancient world when they become a burden on you. And also children. I think the story of the the Akedah, uh, the whole Abraham
Abraham and
bringing
Isaac.
Abraham and Isaac, that whole story is really like an amazing statement in the ancient world where children were property, and people would sacrifice their children to the gods, and that was like normal. And we take it for granted because we're just reading this all the time, and we're just like, okay, it's a very strange story. Why does he want to sacrifice his son? But I think the Torah is making a very strong statement there that we don't own our children.
Yeah. Yeah, and not to mention that the gods of the nations surrounding Israel are engaged in all sorts of immoral, grotesque practices, bestiality, rape, incest, and so forth. And those are the very practices that the Israelites are told to avoid, to stay away from, so that they remain set apart as the people of God.
Yes, and one thing now that you mentioned the set apart, the kedusha, is often mistranslated as holiness, but it really means to sanctify, right? We sanctify the Sabbath from the other days. We're sanctified from the other nations, not because we're better, but because we make distinctions between things, right? We have to distinguish between the realm of God and the realm of man. And making distinctions is a very, very important part of growth, understanding, where we are in the world and where we're supposed to go. So I think that is one of the important points. So Bensi, if you'd like to take the next question.
Absolutely. Okay, so one of the most common critiques leveled at the Torah is that it seems to depict a God who endorses genocide, such as with the Canaanites and the Amalekites, or the killing of the Egyptian firstborns during the 10th plague. Scholars like Dr. William Lane Craig take a literalist view and focus on justifying these events as God condemning the evil of these groups. And given the horrific actions of terrorist groups like Hamas today, it's hard to entirely dismiss this line of reasoning. However, what I appreciate about your approach is the attention to context, including the Torah's use of hyperbole. One example that stands out is King Shaul's command to wipe out all of Amalek, yet just a few chapters later, we find David's camp being raided by Amalekites. And centuries later, Haman, a descendant of Amalek, emerges as an enemy of the Jews in Persia. Could you provide further insights into this, perhaps highlighting other examples where the Torah uses exaggerated or poetic language? Additionally, how should we understand why God would command any kind of collective punishment in the first place?
All right, well, there's a tall order. Let's try to take things one at a time here. And so yes, I have of course, high regard for William Lane Craig, my mentor, in so many ways, and he does hold the line on on basically this being a unique instance of genocide, that it is commanded by God, that God is morally justified in issuing this command. And I would say that as I read this passage from 1 Samuel 15 and other passages, say in Joshua, I just don't see this happening. I see basically a war between combatant armies. It's not, even when you have, say, man, woman, young, and old, these are typically scenarios where you're not going to have elderly people, women, and children hanging around. So let me just say something about the 1 Samuel 15 for starters, and then we can work our way around some of these other texts. So in 1 Samuel 14, we see that in verse 48, the Amalekites have raided the Israelite territory, and so the Lord says to Samuel he tells him to tell Saul to haram, however that's to be translated, often translated utterly destroy, but the man, woman, young, and old of the Amalekites. And so as we read this, there are a few things that are happening. First of all, there is a pitched battle mentioned in verse 5 at a city of Amalek. So at the city of Amalek, you have the Kenites who are also there. And so Saul sends word to the Kenites because they're friendly with the Israelites, and he doesn't have any problem with them. They're not the opponent. They're not the enemy. The Amalekites are. And so he sends word and says, we're going to fight against the Amalekites. So the Kenites end up going away. And so the battle takes place between Israel and the Amalekites. So if the Kenites are leaving, knowing that there's a battle to be fought, certainly they're not going to be women and children hanging around this encampment. They're going to be the first ones to go, in fact. Now, they go on from there to, the text says, not just Saul, but the narrator also tells us that after the battle, it says Saul utterly destroyed, again, Haram, utterly destroyed the Amalekites. Now, as I point out in my book, is God a Vindictive Bully? Sometimes the word haram simply means something like exile, without any kind of genocide or obliteration. Sometimes it can just simply mean a decisive victory, but we're not told about any of the results. And we can come back to Joshua later, but basically, it does not at all. It doesn't have that loaded indication of annihilation, as some people assume. There's some, a number of scholars who say that haram, sometimes rendered utterly destroy, is actually a mistranslation, and there's more to it that I can go into. But even as you look at the text itself and compare other passages in the context and the same book, for example, you see that is not going on at all. There is no genocide. There has not been literal utter destruction. So as was mentioned, we see later on in the book of 1 Samuel that David is fighting against the Amalekites, an Amalekite army. 400 of them end up fleeing on camels. It seems like there are Amalekites all over the place as you read chapters 27 and 30 of 1 Samuel. And there's a common rhetorical device that is used to emphasize this exaggeration, where you have in a lot of ancient Near Eastern war texts mention of a particular pitched battle, which we do have in 1 Samuel 15:5, the city of Amalek. And then there is a picture of universal conquest after that. So Saul is fighting the Amalekites after this battle. It says he's fighting them from Arabia to Egypt, again, a vast territory. And that is a common feature in ancient Near Eastern war texts, where you have a localized battle and then this kind of universal conquest motif. The same thing happens with David. He has a pitched battle, and then he fights the Amalekites again in that same basic terrain. So again, we don't have at all any kind of genocide here. As we look at the cities of Joshua, we go back there, and so the term haram is used, and it says we left no survivor, man, woman, young and old. That same sort of language is being used, but we know from archaeology, from a number of indicators, that these cities that are mentioned in the book of Joshua are actually military installations or administrative centers. They aren't places that house general civilian populations, and so the argument that these are just these cities are teeming with civilians just is not the case. And so I make that argument in both of my books, Moral Monster and Vindictive Bully. But it's interesting that even when you see there were no survivors, you see often that there are survivors just a chapter or two later. So even though it uses that sweeping language, which is common in ancient Near Eastern war texts, what the other ancient Near Eastern war texts don't say is that there were survivors, but the book of Joshua does mention abundant survivors. In fact, when you get to Judges chapter 1, we read repeatedly that the Israelites could not drive them out. They could not drive them out. They could not drive them out. So we have very clear indications that there's a lot more going on here, and it is not a genocidal sort of a thing. It basically is a matter of combatant armies fighting against one another. And I use this. I mentioned this in my Vindictive Bully book, where I talk about the battle of Sihon and Og in Numbers 21. Well, in that battle, it's clearly combatant. We see the people fleeing the villages, and then there is this battle between two combatant armies. And we're told that the king, his sons, and his army are fighting against, they're going out to fight against the Israelites. And then they also have to go between the two rivers in Moab, the Arnon and the Jabbok rivers, that they are, so a 20-mile hike, that they have this all-night hike that they're going from one place to another, carrying their gear and everything. Certainly, you're not going to have women and children on this military march. But Deuteronomy 2 and 3 recounts this battle from Numbers 21. And keep in mind that Deuteronomy intensifies the rhetoric that is found, that is a more tame language, as it were, in, say, Exodus and Numbers. But it says in Numbers 2 and 3 that these two kings, it says that man, woman, young and old were obliterated, that they were, quote, utterly destroyed. But we know that women and children were not around because it was just basically between two combatant armies, the Israelites and these Amorite kings who were fighting against Israel. So it has that sense of exaggeration, hyperbole, rhetoric. But when you look more closely at the battle scene that actually took place, it does not have those civilians included in that battle scene. So those are a few examples. I could go into more details here, but that's something that I think is important to note. So with the Canaanites, with the Amalekites, I do talk about the firstborn of Egypt. I can discuss that if you like, but.
Well, I actually want to just add to that. In the modern times, we say, even like in sports, like we wipe the floor with them, or we use this kind of language, and it's understood in the context of like where we live and when we live. And if somebody, just heard that 1,000 years from now, they'd be like, what does that even mean? Or I'm so hungry I can eat a cow. These are things that this is the way we talk. And the Torah does this. We see it even in like the God destroying Pharaoh's army with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, which is also, kind of like appropriating a phrase from the Battle of Kadesh of Ramses.
Right,
So
exactly.
so the Torah uses this kind of, and in other places, like the most famous one, I think, is where the Torah says, there are cities that reach the heavens, or there are God took us out of Egypt on the wings of eagles. So the language being poetic or hyperbolic is very common.
Exactly right. Yeah, and it's so keeping that intensification in mind, and knowing that this fits squarely within the ancient Near Eastern rhetoric. You mentioned Kadesh. There are other battles that the pharaohs have against sea peoples, or the armies of Mitanni north of what is modern day Iraq, and so forth. That they're saying, that we slew, the pharaohs slew, he destroyed millions. Only he was left. And or even this battle against the sea peoples, Ramesses III basically said that it is fight against the Philistines and other sea peoples, that they basically were rendered non-existent. Well, as it turns out, the sea peoples, the Philistines, would actually come and colonize the eastern part of Egypt. So there's great exaggeration on the part of Ramesses III, talking about his great victory, but he overextended himself and became vulnerable to the sea peoples who would later colonize eastern Egypt. So yeah, you do have that remarkable that type of genre that we need to understand. And if you understand that kind of a setting, these other texts from Joshua and First Samuel and so forth make a lot more sense, and you understand that there is indeed a lot of hyperbole.
Don't we have an inscription, the Merneptah? I'm not so great with this stuff, but there's one that we have an inscription that says Israel is laid to waste and no more.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we
I
do
mean,
have
clearly.
Yeah, exactly. Or you have King Misha saying that that basically Israel is no more, and of course he was speaking prematurely by 100 years. The Assyrians would come into the northern part of the northern kingdom of Israel and would basically do that what King Misha was boasting about.
Right.
This was a language that was used to express total victory. from what I'm
Exactly.
understanding.
Right. Exactly right. Yeah.
All
So
opening.
basically, decisive victory is another, is basically the way to render, at least in a lot of contexts, what haram is. So yeah.
And we also, one of our earliest guests we had is Dr. Joshua Berman, who
Oh
actually,
yeah. Very good. Yeah.
yeah, so he also writes about like numbers being used as symbols in the ancient world, and so the numbers mentioned in the Bible are often not meant to be taken literally. So there are so many things, we can keep digging into these things, but for the skeptic who is listening to this episode, like you said, we need to be more careful, and we need to be, you know, basically, when we read the text, we have to understand that there's a lot more going on, and we have to really appreciate the context. In Hebrew, the word of the simple meaning of the reading the text is called the peshat, but it actually really means the context. You have to understand the context.
Yeah.
So actually, we appreciate the fact that you read the Torah like a rabbi in a way, because your analysis takes into account all these other things that are going on, which is extremely important understanding what's going on.
Well, I appreciate the compliment. I do want to take the text seriously.
So I want to get into that topic of the firstborn son, because obviously genocide, we tackled that, and punishment in general. A lot of people are uneasy about it. How can God even be okay with wiping out the firstborn children of Egypt? Like, how is that justified? So, can you give us a little bit of a background on that?
Sure. Well, of course, when we come into the book of Exodus, we see a great severity, indeed evil treatment of the Hebrew boys. That they are to be drowned in the Nile River, and so of course this is the context in which Moses is rescued, and brought into the household of Pharaoh's daughter and so forth, and is trained in the learning of the Egyptians, etc. But at the very outset, you have a Pharaoh who doesn't remember Joseph. You have an attack out of fear that the Hebrews are rising up, and who knows, maybe they could overthrow the Egyptians, and so let's take preemptive action and get rid of the Hebrew baby boys as they're being born, and then so that's kind of phase one. Then you get to phase two, where there is another Pharaoh who rises up, who is himself nasty. When people talk about God's hardening Pharaoh's heart, we see, I mean, that's just kind of kind of an add-on. We already see a very hardened heart in Pharaoh from the very beginning. And so that's just kind of an additional kind of another layer of hardening that we see going on. But this Pharaoh is cruel, he is oppressive. And so the Lord sends Moses into this setting. And keep in mind the language that takes place in, for example, in Exodus chapter 4, where Israel is God's firstborn. That the pharaohs have been mistreating, say, the Hebrew boys. They've been trying to wanted to put them to death. In the first chapter of Exodus, we see that the Lord is telling Pharaoh that he is to show regard for the Lord's firstborn, namely the people of Israel. And so if he is going to mistreat the Lord's firstborn, then there will be, again, there's that language of God's rendering to everyone according to his deeds, that there is this language of proportionality. Just as you have done to these people, so it will be done to you.
In Hebrew, it's called midah keneged midah.
Right.
Measure for measure.
Right.
Yep, exactly right. Kind of the eye for an eye sort of principle, the lex talionis. That this is a basically, some people see that as quote barbaric, but it's simply usually that it's basically a monetary payment that takes place unless there is murder, and then it's life for life. But basically, it is a proportional judgment that is to be rendered. And so God is doing that. We see that and there's plenty of warning leading up to that firstborn of Egypt plague, where God is basically giving opportunity to relent and not to come to this last resort plague, where, and of course, it does turn out that Pharaoh, finally lets the people of Israel go. But it is, and keep in mind too that it's not as though it's just Pharaoh who's been involved, but it's a widespread system of oppression against the Israelites and other peoples who are also doing work in Egypt. But there is this hostility, there is this hierarchy of a power structure that is oppressing the people of Israel, and so there is widespread guilt that comes along with this too. Let's not forget. So that is part of the ethos here, that God is, if you're going to bring harm to the firstborn, my firstborn, then God is going to bring harm to the firstborn of Egypt, unless of course they take measures to protect themselves from the destroyer, from the angel of death. So that is the kind of context that we're speaking that the scriptures are speaking into. And I think that we may say, oh, that the firstborn of Egypt, that's a terrible thing, but keep in mind what was being done to God's firstborn in the first place. So we need to understand that kind of a setting of that language of the firstborn before we come to that 10th plague.
Right, like they made their bed and now they're sleeping in it.
Exactly.
But the interesting thing for just our listeners, you mentioned the hardening, or in Hebrew also kaved is used. The
Right.
heaviness of the heart is actually a call to what the pharaohs would do when a previous pharaoh would die. They would put his heart on a scale and measure it and put it on the other side of the scale. They would put a feather on, and if the heart was heavier, then it would mean that pharaoh was evil. This is a way of the new pharaoh saying, like, I'm not going to be like that previous pharaoh. So the Torah is actually making a poetic statement by saying that Paro, you want to know how evil he is? This is the heaviness of the heart, that it's calling to that practice that was done.
Yeah.
Another thing is, regarding what you mentioned with the firstborn, the fighting against the 10 plagues are actually a repudiation of, or polemic against, the ancient Egyptian gods. So the Nile,
Exactly.
the gods, the Nile was used as the deity that consumed the Jewish, the Israelite children and killed them. And also the second plague, which was frog, which is the god Heket, which is the fertility goddess in Egypt, the frog head and the human body. So this is like the first two plagues are basically midah keneged midah. It's measure for measure against trying to stop the Israelites from procreating and from growing their population.
Right. Yeah. And in fact, Exodus 12:12 reminds us that these plagues are directed, kind of a terse statement that they're directed against the deities of Egypt. And what's interesting about the actions of God in the plagues is that they are directed against the superpower of the day. That this is the world's leading nation of that time. And here the people of Israel are, the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt. And instead of, it's kind of an interesting thing, because the Lord, the God of those slaves, is the one who is bringing judgment upon this superpower. And it's not as though he needs some kind of home court advantage, to fight on his own turf. No, he is going on foreign turf and winning the battle against those deities there.
Right. And one thing maybe that ties into this as well is, so we have like that kind of punishment. We also have capital punishment, and we also have punishment where in the story of the flood, you have the world, or the Aretz, that region basically suffering a flood that wipes out a large group of people. So how do we understand that in context as well?
Yeah. Yeah, and I too, it sounds like you're taking the flood as something regional rather than global, which is my take as well. That the Haaretz that is covered, as you even read in chapter 11, that the whole land, Haaretz, spoke one language, and then it says it moved eastward. So if it's the whole globe, it would be strange for everyone to move eastward. But if it's a region, that is describable, say, moving east of the land of Canaan toward say Babylon, Shinar, and so on, then that makes a lot more sense. So they go and build that Tower of Babel. And so you have a picture of this flood then that impacts humanity. But what is interesting is that the God is simply finishing the job that human beings have begun. It is he is pained in doing this. It grieves him. This is something that is done with reluctance, with a heavy heart, that God brings judgment upon the people. But basically, human beings have already done most of the damage. And basically, God is saying, I'm going to start over. It's not as though God abandons humanity. God is going to start to rebuild. And so we have the language in Genesis 6 through 9 of a recreation of the mention in chapter 9 of the image of God, of being fruitful and multiplying and so forth, but also giving human beings the capacity, the power, the authority to, when they shed blood, that their blood should be shed, because they're taking the lives of those who are made in the image of God. And so there is this kind of a governing role that human beings are to have, and to keep violence at bay, and to protect those who are being whom others would want to harm as God's image bearers. So you have that kind of a rebuilding of the creation, and that God is also setting out certain measures and also making promises about this kind of a catastrophe not happening again. So yeah, there is a lot more that could be said in terms of the theology of the flood, of what is going on. There are a lot of important theological principles that could be unpacked. But yeah, that's basically where, I don't know, I'll just maybe leave it there for my comments.
Yeah, so if I can add to that, if we understand the Torah in the context of the ancient world, there was this idea of a flood was well known in other previous epics, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis. These are describing similar. So something did happen, right?
Sure.
There was some kind of flood that did happen. But I think what we have to take out of this is, what is the Torah's message? What is the lesson the Torah's trying to teach us? And it actually veers completely away from where the ancients understood the story, whereas where the Torah actually says that God created everything kitov and it was very good, right? But when it came to creating man chooses between good and evil, right? It puts the onus on man, not on the gods, or not on God. And then at the culmination of this whole story was that there was, the word is Hamas, but there was violence among the people who were doing. It was anarchy. They were doing whatever they wanted to each other. And like you said, they did it to each other. God is just kind of finishing what they started. And there was regret. The Torah mentions that he had regret. So clearly we have to see, I think, the character of Noach as somebody who, he is somebody who's reflecting after what happened as kind of like a missed opportunity. He starts to drink because he realized maybe he could have helped some people. This is at least in the Jewish tradition, that he could have helped and he could have tried to save others. And later on, we're introduced to Abraham, who's kind of like correcting that characteristic. Okay, so we're going to go to the next question, which is the institution of slavery, which is universally condemned as morally abhorrent, and that's something we all agree on. How then do we make sense of the Bible condoning both Israelite and non-Israelite slavery? It's important to distinguish between the chattel slavery practiced by the American South and the slavery described in the Torah, which was not permanent and dehumanizing in the same way. So can you give us some context on how the Bible's teaching on this topic were transformative for their time? After all, it was the influence of Judeo-Christian values that eventually led to the eradication of slavery in the modern world. And while we're on the subject, how should we interpret the Bible's treatment of women, particularly in areas of marriage, divorce, and captivity?
Yeah. Okay, let's tackle the matter of servitude. And I speak of servitude. I don't use the term slavery because that language, even though a lot of modern translations use it, even though older ones don't use that term slavery, even whether it's English, like the King James Version only has the term slave once. And that's not even in the Hebrew text, but it's but other like German and Dutch and Spanish and so forth, that the older renderings don't have the heavier kind of kind of emotionally laden slave language. But that's really kind of strange with all that's taken place in terms of modern slavery, that they would bring this into modern translations and I think mislead many people into thinking, oh, we're just basically revisiting modern slavery, just by going backward in time. And so what I try to do is highlight that the term servitude is something that doesn't rig the conversation. So you look at it's sort of like using the term king. You don't just go ahead and translate. Somebody may be a puppet king, but you don't go ahead and translate that as puppet king. You just leave it as king, and you let the context to shape how that king is to be understood. In the same way, in terms of servitude, for example, you have Moses, you have Joshua, who are described as each of them is described as an Eved Adonai, a servant of the Lord, and that this is an honorific title. And what we mean by servitude is basically a kind of a dynamic dependency relationship, and especially one that in ancient Israel is shifting with the payment of when you pay off your debts, you are free to go. You're no longer an indentured servant, and so there is a certain dynamism here, but it basically reflects a dependency relationship. And we use this kind of language in our, we have a kind of, a transactional language in with our own sports teams. Like we have owners, we have players that are bought, that they're traded, and so forth. And that this is obviously not diminishing the humanity of these basketball or baseball players or whatever. It is simply using that kind of transactional language. And in the same way, we had that kind of transactional language that is used of both the Israelite servant as well as the foreign servant. So, for example, the Israelite servant is can be acquired, kana, just as you have, for example, in Leviticus 25, the foreign servants who can be acquired, kana. So the evedim, the toshavim, those the gerim and the toshavim, those who are sojourning, those who are dwelling amongst you as resident aliens. That language is used later on in chapter 25. These foreigners who can be acquired, those people can become persons of means. As you keep reading the chapter, a lot of critics will stop at the end of being able to acquire them and so forth, but keep reading. Those, that person who is sojourning as an alien is also may become a person of means, to the point that he may acquire, kana, an Israelite servant of his to work for him. So you have language of prospering. If the foreigner in Israel prospers, then he can acquire an Israelite, just as the foreigner can be acquired. The Israelite can prosper at the end of Leviticus 25. So the same sort of language is being used of both the foreigner as well as the Israelite, and there isn't a diminishing of their humanity. So we can go in to talk about, some people will talk about certain treatments of the Israelite the Hebrew servant in Exodus 21, where it says that you may, there are certain regulations regarding the Israelites. So if you strike a servant, a Hebrew, so that he dies. Well, it's interesting that this the term that is used is typically used of capital punishment, that he should be avenged. that this is, it basically affirms the dignity of the in this case the Hebrew servant, and so if he is struck so that he dies, then the one who struck him, his quote master or employer, his life is to be taken. Now, some people, the critics will sometimes say, well, look at what it continues to say, that if he survives a day or two, then this person is, then there is no there is no death penalty or anything like that, and that this person basically, it says, it goes on to say, some translations will say he is his property or he is his silver. Well, what is the context here? It's actually the context of accidental death and paying for medical fees. And so Harry Hoffner, the late Egyptologist at the University of Chicago, said that basically what we're talking about here is that if you pay someone's medical fees, then this is a way of kind of in a sense, diminishing the severity of the punishment because you've taken the initiative to pay for the person whom you've injured, paying those medical bills. And that same sort of a thing is happening in, because that is the context of accidental injury, that if you're paying for if you're using your silver to pay for this medical fee, it's not as though it says, there's that rendering. It says he, who, the Hebrew word is his silver. Well, it could also be translated that medical fee is his silver. And so there's another way of rendering that, rather than seeing the Hebrew servant as property. Basically, the medical fee is that silver that actually is to be figured in when the judge is rendering a verdict about the person who has struck the person so that he doesn't die, but for a day or two, and then he dies. So that is figured into the broader judicial equation. So anyway, there are a number of other texts that we could get into to talk about servitude, but I think it's important to remember that servitude is basically what happens when you're impoverished and you have no recourse, and so you quote sell yourself. Whether you're a foreigner or you might be acquired in warfare or something like that, but those who are quote acquired, say within Israel, that there is a term limit of 6 years, and you cannot keep that Israelite servant beyond 6 years. That to keep him from getting out of, or from even going into poverty or to servitude in the first place, you have gleaning laws, you have no interest loans, and so forth. That there are provisions for those who are poor Israelites to keep themselves from having to sell themselves into servitude. We also have various arrangements, such as in Exodus 21, that if there is a person who says, "I love my master, my employer," then that person can, through this piercing of his ear, through that ceremony, using the awl, that he then would become a permanent servant, but this would be voluntary. And so the biblical scholar David Kleins said that if you have these two laws, one that says about the foreign runaway slave, that if the foreign runaway slave comes to Israel, he could settle in any of Israel's cities. And so if a foreign servant is running away to get away from a harsh, oppressive master, how much more would that apply within Israel? In fact, when we read about, for example, when David's men go to Nabal, Nabal, who is Abigail's husband, and they say, "We're David's servants," and he said, "Who is David? Who are his servants? We've got servants running away from their masters all the time." So that was basically done in Israel, that if you had a tough time with someone who was to whom were your indentured servant, you could get out from under that oppression by virtue of runaway. And so David Klein says that if you have the option of runaway, or if you have the option of aligning yourself to, belonging to the household of your employer, quote, master, he said this basically undermines any kind of institutionalization of slavery or servitude within Israel, because there is free will that is involved. There is protection also for those who are being oppressed. In fact, there's a law that's of course mentioned in Leviticus about tattooing. What is tattooing all about? Well, to have a tattoo, some people have associated that with say a foreign deity, that perhaps you're tattooed because you belong to a foreign deity, and so therefore you shouldn't do that. Or it could be sometimes associated with with cutting practice, cutting for the dead. But probably the most plausible interpretation of that is that it's related to being enslaved to another person, that you have a tattoo because you belong to another person. But God is prohibiting that you do not belong to another person as that person's property, that you are owned by someone else. No, that is prohibited in Israel. So that tattoo, which is a mark of ownership of another person, is being prohibited within Israel because that is not how you should treat people.
So
oh, sorry. Oh, I was just going to mention the two verses that you mentioned. I don't have the verses in front of me. I'm in a hotel room, so but the one where if he kills the indentured servant, then he gets killed, and then if he injures him, there's the monetary payout.
Yeah, right. It's
actually really
21:12, Exodus 21:12. Yeah,
21:12. Okay, so I actually was, during the portion of the week which fell on it, I was actually doing that with my older daughter. I was going through the verses, and she caught me on that one because she was like, "Wait a minute," like, you know what I mean? And I was on the spot, and I didn't really reflect on it yet. So I really appreciate that you said this. I'm hopefully even ask her to listen to it. But as you were saying this, it would be inconsistent and sort of illogical why wouldn't the use of "because he is your property" used for the payout verses then not apply when you killed him?
Right, exactly. Right. Yeah.
It's just all of a sudden that doesn't apply, and you're put to death.
Yeah.
If the quintessence of the whole idea here is that that he is your property, then logically speaking, and people, there's a lot of opinions regarding
Mm-hmm.
how to understand morality and the Bible, but being illogical, usually there's a extremely consistent logic, right? Internal logic within the Bible is pretty much, people can pretty much see that there is an internal logic within the Bible. So for that logic of "he's your property" to not be applied when he kills that indentured servant makes no sense. And that is what was coming to my mind as you were going through the sequence. And I appreciate you speaking about this because it's very enlightening.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your mentioning that's very, very critical to keep that in mind. So and so there is, obviously if the person strikes him so that he dies, then he will be put to death. There'll be he'll be avenged. Clearly, the humanity of the Hebrew servant is very much in focus here.
Absolutely,
there's human rights for sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so I did want to touch on one thing regarding that because Alex O'Connor, famous, I guess you can call it agnostic or atheist. I don't know what he considers himself, but
Right.
he famously had on William Lane Craig and Ben Shapiro and others challenging the Bible, and he poses this question: is that okay? Fine. There's all these explanations for why, like you just mentioned, for why this isn't actual slavery, but why wouldn't God just say no slavery at all, no servitude at all?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I would say, well, if you're using the term slave in a way that connotes Southern antebellum slavery, well, you've already rigged the debate. You've already kind of, stacked the deck against the scriptures. But if you understand this as servitude, if you understand this as, say, indentured servitude, I mean, this is, we did this, say, when our, forebears from Europe came to this country. They would have to pay for their passage after they came here. So they'd be indebted for, say, 7 years to pay the passage that they, for their ship to come from Europe to the New World. And, was that oppressive? slavery? No, that's just a way of taking care of your debts. If you can't handle payment on the spot, well, you've got to work overtime to pay off that debt, and then you're free to go about as an ordinary free citizen now that your debt is paid. We have certain sorts of debts that we enter into voluntarily through, serving in the army or something like that, or maybe even having a kind of a mundane job. There's nothing else to do except maybe a tough, grinding job that we have to do. That's not tantamount to slavery. There are just going to be some jobs that are harsh, that are difficult, that we may not want to do, but that may be the only way to earn our our livelihood. And so we go with it. But when it comes to this notion of that should have been banned altogether, well, we're not living. This is not a society that has a democracy, a welfare system, Social Security, and so forth. There's, people can fall through the cracks very easily, and of course there's family and so forth, and we see a lot of dependency upon, say, those who are part of your clan to help keep you out of debt, to in a sense redeem you if you had to sell yourself to someone for a period of time, that they can buy you out. But sometimes that isn't possible. And so what do? Well, in a sense, the Mosaic law, as it were, is doing the best it can with the kind of situation on the ground. So we need to be careful about forcing a modern Western viewpoint of things on an ancient Near Eastern culture where these structures just simply were not in place. And there's a kind of building that needs to be done, a kind of a network, kind of a social security system that's being built, but it certainly is far from complete. It is not a developed sort of thing that we have, say, in the modern world.
Absolutely. It's easy to want to dispel things, but was there any capability of having anything different really at that time? It's like you said, it's asking for something that might not, it's not something that the world was capable of to be able to contain at that time. Today we live in a whole different world.
Right.
It's built differently and allows for different opportunities that just wasn't there at that time.
Yeah, and even if you have this kind of a structure that is not optimal, even though you had that in place, you are still not to oppress your fellow Israelite. You're not to oppress the foreigner who is in your midst. So whether an Israelite, whether a foreigner, you are not to be an oppressor of those people, especially when they're vulnerable. This is really the heartbeat of the Mosaic law. Do not oppress those who can be easily taken advantage of, all the more that they are to be looked out for.
And would you also make the case that whether it eradicated slavery at the time, but eventually these values that the Bible presents became kind of the building blocks for the eradication of slavery in the modern Western world? Would you agree with that?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, some people will say, look, you've got Leviticus 25, you've got some of these texts, but you also have kind of the modern, well, one, you have a reinforcement of the image of God, that all people are made in the image of God. A lot of, it's something that was not the case in the ancient Near East, where you have now a kind of a racializing of slavery in the modern world. That this is, and you have you have abused texts like the curse of Cain, or the mark of, kind of you have this presumption that, say, the curse against Canaan is some sort of a skin color or something like that. So really a terrible misuse of the scriptures taking place by these modern interpreters who are trying to justify slavery in that very oppressive sense. And basically what I write about in both my books, the Moral Monster book, the Vindictive Bully book, is to say that if the Mosaic law were actually being followed, you would not have had the kind of problems with slavery in the modern world that we have experienced. If you, for example, gave opportunity for one thing, kidnapping was prohibited, not just in Israel, but widespread throughout the ancient Near East. Kidnapping was something that was capitally punishable. So that's how modern slavery got started in the first place. So there's that. And then you've got, again, provisions that are given to the Israelites, given to the Israelites to gleaning laws so they don't go into poverty and have to sell themselves into servitude. You've got you have the 6-year term limits that you're not to go beyond, and once you're done, you're debt free. You also have the remarkable that runaway slave law, that if a foreign slave runs away, he is not to be returned to his harsh master. Well, the antebellum South had the fugitive slave laws that, again, you had to return the runaway slave to his master because that was his property. And in fact, in the ancient Near East, you had extradition treaties between the Babylonians and the Hittites and so forth to return those runaway slaves, and often very much that there were stiff penalties, sometimes body mutilations if you were a runaway slave. And the Code of Hammurabi says that from Babylon, it says that if you are harboring a runaway slave, then you too could be capitally punished. So there is that very strong penalty that goes along with harboring runaway slaves. But the Mosaic law says if there's a foreign runaway slave, he is to be able to, he could settle in any of Israel's cities. So a remarkable contrast here.
Beautifully said.
Really amazing.
And the last part that we want to touch on is the idea of women being kind of owned, or children being owned, with like the rebellious son, and the capital punishment with that, and maybe like we could touch on a captive woman from a war. How do you understand this within the context?
Yeah, well, of course, we see at the very beginning that there are laws that reflect the basic understanding of human beings being made in the image of God. So when you have the 10 Commandments, for example, mentioning that you're to honor your father and your mother, not honor your father and a piece of furniture. You honor your father and property. There is a dignity that is being upheld, about the woman. Even when you read, for example, the Eshet Chayil, the strong, virtuous woman, the woman of character, and of course, Ruth herself is called an Eshet Chayil. In the book of in the book of Ruth, again reflecting, again, of course, in the Hebrew scriptures, the book of Proverbs is followed by the book of Ruth, and so that kind of Ruth is exemplifying that Eshet Chayil, who is this strong, virtuous woman, this woman who makes things happen. Just reading Proverbs 30:31, you see a woman who is taking initiative. You see a woman who is, in a sense, the professional in her own sphere, who is engaged in real estate, engaged in commerce. Of course, she's clothing her family, taking care of them, and her husband is at the city gates, doing his own, having his own leadership role there. But basically, you see there's and I talk about this in the book, Is God a Vindictive Bully, where there is a hierarchy. Rather than a patriarchy, which is actually an anachronistic term, there is a hierarchy. That is, males have certain areas where they are skilled, where they are the professionals. And you also have women who are engaged in areas where they are skilled, where they're doing their thing, and that there is this interdependency, given those basic skill sets, that correspond to what males and females do, that they depend upon one another, that they reinforce one another, they complement one another, rather than seeing women as being treated in a denigrating sort of way. There is a strong complementarity to make a family operate in an integrated way, or even the society to operate in that integrated way. So again, I could go into a lot more detail, but we see women who are rising in leadership. I mean, of course, you have negative negative examples like Jezebel and Athaliah and so forth. But you have the Shunammite woman, who is this prominent woman, Gedolah in Shunem. And she persuades her husband to have an upper chamber built for Elisha when he comes through. When there is a famine in the land, that she basically mobilizes her household to leave for Philistia. And then when she returns, her property has been taken over by squatters. So she goes and appeals to the king in order to get back her property, which he grants her. So you do see these influential, proactive women. We talk about Ruth, we talk about Naomi, we can talk about the wise woman of Tekoa, we can talk about all these, Deborah and Esther.
The daughters of Tzlafchad were like able to convince Moshe through God to literally
inherit property. Exactly.
Property. God tells Abraham to listen to Sarah, whatever she says.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, I wanted to put that in its proper context, because so often that gets minimized by looking maybe at, look at this particular passage, look at how the women are treated. And of course, it's often a misunderstanding anyway. But I just want to offer the broader context that male and female are both image bearers. They're both to be treated with honor in the household, that the children are to listen to both their father and their mother, to honor their father and mother, and so forth. So anyway, but let me just mention a couple of things here. That there are sometimes for example, in Deuteronomy 21, there is mention of this ceremony where there are prisoners of war who come into Israel, and there is the possibility of a soldier taking on a foreign woman as a wife, and she would be incorporated into Israel. But some people see this as basically that there's a kind of rape of women prisoners of war and so forth. And that is again an uncharitable reading of what we see going on in that passage. What is happening here? For one thing, war rape was not permitted at all for Israelite soldiers. That, yes, it was carried out by other ancient Near Eastern peoples in warfare settings, and sometimes the women prisoners of war were put into the temples of their gods as sex slaves and so forth, prostitutes. But not for the Israelites. There was to be a waiting period that even as you look at the example of Uriah the Hittite, who even when he's called home from the battle to lie with his wife to cover up David's sin, he said, "How can I do so when my comrades are on the front lines risking their lives? No, I'm not going to do this thing." So he did not go into his wife to have sexual relations while his brothers were fighting on the front lines. And also, you look at David's men when they go to the priest, at Nob, and they ask for the sacred bread, and the priest asks, he says, "Have your men had sexual relations with women?" And David says, "No, they have not." So there is that presupposition that you go into war. There's a kind of ritual purity that you are undertaking as you go into battle. So it's not something you don't engage in sexual relations on the battlefield. This is something that is like holy territory. You are to be abstaining from those things while you're engaging in this task. But anyway, we can say that when you have this prisoner of war, this woman who is taken as a Gentile into the home of an Israelite man, there is a 30-day waiting period. And of course there is to be she shaves her head and clips her nails. She puts on sackcloth and so forth to lament, to say farewell to the previous life that she lived, and basically as a transition to a new way of life now in Israel. This is actually a very, I think, gracious and compassionate sort of response. In fact, if the soldier decides not to take her as his wife, he is reminded to treat her kindly with graciousness. It says, because you have humiliated her. Doesn't mean you've had sex with her, but she's gone through that ceremony of humiliation. And so she is not to be treated she's not to be mistreated. There's a certain gentleness here that is being depicted of these prisoner of war women. And so this is actually should be seen as an elevating of the vulnerable woman who is making this sort of transition. And keep in mind that this is again, to be a marriage ceremony. It's not as though this is a sexual object here. This is entering into marriage. So there's that month-long waiting period. There's that mourning. There's a marriage covenant before there are sexual relations and so forth. So there's a concern for the woman's honor here, that she should not be shamed or humiliated, and so on. So that's a little bit of the context here when it comes to, say, the prisoners of war and the women and how they're to be treated, how they're to be regarded.
Well, one thing I would say, it doesn't directly relate to your point, but I think it does in a way, in that you see that the Bible spends a lot of time narratively talking about women. It's a huge focal point. I mean, all over. I mean, especially in Genesis, like
the daughter of Pharaoh, daughter of Pharaoh.
Daughter of Pharaoh, the Shifra and Pua. You have Rachel and Leah with Bilhah and Zilpah, and you have
Tamar,
Tamar, and it's if the Bible was dismissive of women, I doubt, just intuitively, I doubt so much of the real estate in the Bible would be focusing so much on the lives of these women and what they have, how they literally established our nation.
Absolutely.
From an intuitive perspective, I'm talking. Besides besides just the literary points, I think that when one reads the Bible as a whole, you really don't get that feeling if you read it carefully and if you read it with intuitively. So,
absolutely. Yep. Very well said.
So the last part, which is really before we go, I know you have to run, but the let's say the Wayward Son, that whole story, as in the Jewish tradition, we don't believe that there was ever such a case, and it's used kind of like a scare tactic. I'm wondering if you see that kind of the same way.
Right. Yeah, I do. And one of the things that I made a little bit of a modification from the Moral Monster book to the Vindictive Bully book, where I do take the view more strongly that these punishments, say stoning or burning, etc., these are exaggerations for to in a sense to have the Israelite people straighten up and fly right, that they are going to be attending to these things, that these are things that are serious, that if you undertake these things, it's going to lead to a breakdown, it's going to be leading to destruction, and so on, and that this is going to bring harm to the community. And so we see that firstborn son, if he, that this is an example of a delinquent son who is, there's a dereliction of duty here, who should be rising up and basically caring for the family rather than squandering his life and bringing hardship to the rest of the family. But you have a couple of case studies of capital punishment, but really that's the exception rather than the rule. You have very severe punishments, and again, we could extend this to the Code of Hammurabi and other ancient Near Eastern law collections, where you'll have sometimes almost overly severe punishments that for a surgeon or to have your hand cut off or to have your child killed, if you go into this profession and you are a slipshod builder or you're not careful as a surgeon. Well, who's going to go into the building profession? Who's going to go into the surgical profession if those are the drastic outcomes that could come to you? So there is this sort of an exaggeration for effect, basically saying, don't do these things. Don't take shortcuts in your work. Don't do slipshod work. And so they just serve as severe warnings. Like I mentioned that in my Vindictive Bully book, that the goring ox of chapter 20, Exodus 21, there are very, we have out of all of these, case laws and inscriptions and so forth that we have from the ancient Near East, you have very little mention of any sort of goring ox. You'd think, oh, goring oxes, that happened all the time. No, it was just kind of an example that's kind of taken and using it as a case study, sort of like, if you've got a goring ox and you're not taking control of it, if it has in the habit of goring people, you're being negligent and you could be punished. It's kind of like having bad brakes and you're riding with brakes that don't work very well, and you could be liable if you don't repair those brakes, and you run someone over because your brakes have not been taken care of. So you have those sorts of examples. But yeah, exactly to the point that those punishments are, there's something drastic about them, but again, there's a high degree of hyperbole or exaggeration in those punishments.
Yeah, and even the way that in the rabbinic tradition, the way they interpreted this is like the rabbis were very, very like careful about even capital punishment, applying or enforcing capital punishment. They would say like once every 7 years or every 70 years, if there was ever some type of capital punishment, it was a very like it was considered like a kind of right. Yeah, like a Sanhedrin that took it too far, but really like the emphasis on preserving life is very much part of the tradition.
Right.
And I wanted to say, I think one of the points you touched on, I think is probably one of the most powerful statements that the Bible makes is that the democratization of quote unquote divinity, where God gives all of mankind, it's not just Israelites, but all of mankind through Adam, he gives them this Tselem Elohim.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that it's extremely powerful because in the ancient world, like you mentioned, there was a hierarchical structure and there were man gods, right? There was the divine, like the pharaohs and Nimrod and all these characters. They took kind of the position of God. So it's extremely powerful. And before we go, I just want to sincerely thank you once again for joining us. We truly appreciate your time. And before we wrap up, can you tell our audience where they can find more of your work and what where your online content is?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, my website is paulcopan.com, paulcopan.com, where you can see some of the stuff that I've worked on. If you want to look at the books that I've written, edited, co-edited, etc., you can just go to my authors page at Amazon.com, and you can see the various books that I've worked on. And we talked about, say, the flood, and even the use of numbers in the Old Testament. And I co-authored a book with Douglas Jacoby on Genesis 1 through 11 that looks at it from a kind of a theological and moral point of view, and brings in some of those insights. So that might be of interest. There's a book called Origins that looks at Genesis 1 through 11. But basically, the books we've been talking about is God a Moral Monster, is God a Vindictive Bully. Hopefully, your audience will find those helpful, and that they'll be able to have a greater understanding of the biblical text, of the ancient Near Eastern context, and hopefully this will bring illumination and clarification for them.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. God bless you. Thank you.
And you as well. A pleasure to be with you.
All right. Take care.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.